Tonight, we're stepping into a world of shadows, where history wasn't written with quills, but carved with daggers. Forget the romantic stories of knights in shining armor, or lords feasting in candlelit halls. This is the darker story behind the throne, the disturbing life of a medieval assassin. These weren't swashbuckling heroes or noble rebels. They were tools of terror, bred in silence, paid in secrecy, and erased from history once their blade had done its work. They lived half dead, ghosts in their own time, feared by the people, used by the powerful, and remembered only as whispers that could topple kings. So before we dive in, make sure the lights are dim, the room is still, and your mind is ready for the unsettling truth. Because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's the anatomy of fear itself. And hey, before we start unraveling this nightmare from the Middle Ages, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Let me know what time it is where you are watching this. Are you catching this story at 3 a.m. with the shadows pressing in on your walls? Or at noon when the world outside feels safe and bright? Either way, you're here in the dark with me now. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into history's most chilling corners. Welcome to the disturbing life of a medieval assassin. Chapter 1. Born in Shadows. The Making of an Assassin. If you want to understand the disturbing life of a medieval assassin, you must begin not with the kill but with the cradle, because assassins were not born monsters. They were carved into them by poverty, politics, and the machinery of fear. Picture the early Middle Ages, towns stinking with unwashed hides, alleys cluttered with beggars whose bones protruded like scaffolding beneath thin skin, and children raised in hovels where rats were more reliable companions than priests. In such a world, violence wasn't an exception, it was currency. A child abandoned at the monastery gate, or orphaned after one of the endless feudal skirmishes, was as likely to be taken in by mercenaries, thieves' guilds, or shadowy religious sects as by kindly monks. Chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries whisper of secret brotherhoods, men who cloaked their daggers in vows of silence and prayer, their discipline drilled not with psalms but with poisons. The infamous Hashashin of the Middle East, from which our modern word assassin descends, were said to recruit young men barely past childhood, drug them with hashish or wine, and immerse them in staged paradises where gardens bloomed unnaturally and women moved like sirens of salvation. When they woke in the gray barracks of a fortress clinging to a cliff, their only thought was to earn a permanent return to that paradise by carrying out the sacred killings their masters commanded. Whether this is fact, rumor, or a smear campaign by their enemies matters less than the psychological truth. Children were conditioned to equate murder with transcendence, and Europe was not immune to the contagion. Italian city-states and French courts fostered their own secretive killers, not as mystical sects, but as tools of politics. A young boy from a poor family might be taken in by a condottiera, trained to use blades as deftly as a farmer used a plow, taught the art of silence, the geometry of alleys, and the difference between cutting muscle and cutting artery. Documents from Bologna and Venice record payments to special messengers, whose duties involved more than letters. Imagine the childhood of such a boy, every meal earned by obedience, every lesson wrapped in pain, every friendship shadowed by the knowledge that betrayal was punished, not with rebuke, but with mutilation. To be an assassin was to grow up in a laboratory of cruelty, where survival was a skill and loyalty was purchased by terror. This is why medieval assassins were so disturbing, not because they were monsters, but because they were manufactured by societies that needed them, wanted them, and quietly applauded them from behind curtains. Their lives began in hunger, were sharpened by fear, and were sanctified by the same lords and bishops who denounced murder in sermons, but paid gold for discreet deaths in practice. The assassin's cradle was not a crib, but a weapon rack, and his lullaby was the whisper of steel, drawn in the dark. Chapter 2. The Silent Profession. Techniques of Death and Disguise. By the time a medieval assassin reached adulthood, his life was less a story and more a toolkit, a disturbing compendium of poisons, daggers, disguises, and psychological manipulation that makes modern spycraft look almost quaint. Chroniclers in Italian communes and Arabic courts describe assassins as masters of invisibility in plain sight. A man could be a monk by dawn, a merchant by noon, and a killer by night, his entire identity a costume stitched from observation. Their most treasured weapon was not the dagger, but patience. Some were known to live for months embedded in enemy households, serving as servants, cooks, or scribes, waiting for a single moment to strike. Venetian records in the 14th century note a servant who poisoned a duke's chalice only after 7 years of faithful service, disappearing before suspicion hardened into proof. Their arsenal included blades slim enough to pass unnoticed under robes, daggers designed to pierce chainmail through the armpit or groin, and powders that could be slipped into wine to mimic the symptoms of plague or dysentery, killing not only the target, but masking the deed as natural death. The Hashashin were infamous for daggers inscribed with Quranic verses, stabbing in public as a theatrical gesture to sow terror, while their European counterparts preferred silence, strangulation with garrots, or the sudden collapse of a poisoned victim at banquet. Payment was often in coin, but sometimes in absolution. Clerics were known to absolve noble patrons in advance, treating murder for hire as a regrettable but necessary form of politics. And yet, this was not a glamorous life. The assassin lived always half dead, his meals measured in paranoia, his sleep broken by the rustle of imagined pursuers. He could never settle, never marry, never leave scars of love behind him, because attachment was liability. Town records whisper of assassins discovered mutilated in alleys, their own employers silencing them before secrets could leak. Others vanished into prisons where their bones outlasted their names. What makes their profession most disturbing is not the kill itself, but the banality of it. Death became a job like blacksmithing or brewing, except the product was silence, terror, and absence. And this job was tolerated, even admired, by the very societies that claimed to be God-fearing. The assassin was the iron in the velvet glove of medieval politics, and his existence revealed a truth few wanted to admit. Beneath the sermons, beneath the codes of chivalry, beneath the poetry of knights and saints, medieval Europe was run by the blade in the dark, the whispered order, and the man who was paid to disappear after delivering it. Chapter 3. The Weight of Silence. Inside the assassin's mind. To live as a medieval assassin was to live with silence pressing down heavier than armor, because silence was both shield and prison. Unlike a knight whose glory blared in trumpets, or a merchant who boasted of his cargo, the assassin carried his reputation only in whispers, rumors so toxic they could not be claimed as pride, but only endured as shadows. Imagine the inner life of such a man, every smile rehearsed, every gesture rehearsed, every step measured like a chess piece sliding across a blood-stained board. He had to be a master of memory, not just remembering the layout of corridors or the patterns of guards, but memorizing lies told weeks earlier so that his cover did not fracture. Chroniclers hint that some assassins lived with a paranoia so profound they never slept in the same bed twice, never ate from the same pot 2 nights running, and never walked the same street at the same hour. The very skills that kept them alive also eroded them from within. To lie so often is to lose a sense of self. To disguise oneself endlessly is to forget who the true face belongs to. That is perhaps the most disturbing reality. Many assassins were not just feared by others, they feared themselves, their identities dissolving like salt in water. There are scattered stories of killers who, after years of infiltration, forgot which side they served, some even defending their intended victims out of some warped instinct, unable to separate mask from flesh. And then there was the guilt, not always visible, but festering like a wound beneath the surface. Religious Europe offered absolution for sins, but what priest could cleanse the soul of a man who killed not in rage, not in self-defense, but for coin or command? The confessions of captured assassins, sometimes recorded by scribes, drip with madness. One Italian killer claimed the Virgin Mary whispered to him through the hilt of his dagger. Another in Paris wept that he could no longer distinguish the faces of those he killed, because all of them looked like his mother in the instant before the blade struck. This mental erosion was not weakness. It was the occupational hazard of living every day in the twilight between life and death. Sleep brought nightmares of bodies tumbling down staircases, of poisoned cups clattering to the floor, of faces twisted in disbelief. Waking life offered no relief, only the same rehearsals, the same masks, the same knowledge that at any hour he could be betrayed by his master, denounced by a rival, or recognized by a child who had once seen him in another guise. To be an assassin was to be enslaved not by chains but by silence, to walk through life as a ghost among the living, condemned not just by society but by one's own mind. The disturbing truth is that medieval assassins were not only killers of others, they were slow-motion suicides, destroying their own humanity, one disguise, one lie, one corpse at a time. Chapter 4: Blood on the Ledger. Betrayal, death, and the assassin's end. No assassin expected to die peacefully in bed, and the ways they met their ends reveal more about medieval politics than about the killers themselves. Death for an assassin was rarely heroic. It was transactional, like everything else in his profession. Some were executed publicly, dragged before jeering crowds who didn't even know the real crime, but were eager for blood. In Florence, in the 14th century, city ledgers record the hanging of a man accused of political murders, his body later quartered and displayed across the city walls. Others died quietly, poisoned by the very lords who hired them, their usefulness expiring like ink on a contract. The disturbing pattern is that assassins were disposable tools, valued only until the job was done, then discarded like broken daggers. Chronicles from Venice describe hired killers drowned secretly in canals, their corpses weighed with stones so no loose tongue could compromise a noble's schemes. The Hashashin in the East sometimes embraced martyrdom, deliberately killing in public knowing death would follow, because for them terror was as valuable as survival, as survival, as survival. But in Europe, the assassin's end was more often betrayal, promised gold never paid, safe houses raided by soldiers, or rival killers sent to erase the first. Psychological collapse was another fate. Some assassins, so unmoored from reality, walked into churches babbling confessions that horrified priests, their words more disturbing than their deeds. One German monk wrote of a killer who believed he was already dead, wandering from town to town, announcing himself as a ghost until villagers beat him to death in a panic. The horror was not just in how they died, but in how easily society forgot them. Unlike knights whose names were sung, assassins vanished into anonymity, remembered only in ledgers that listed them as disbursed payment, or in sermons warning against the dagger in the dark. Their bodies were sometimes denied Christian burial, left to rot at crossroads as warnings. Others were buried in unmarked pits, their bones indistinguishable from criminals and paupers. Yet the irony is that even in death, assassins served their masters, because their grisly ends reminded the public that power was ruthless and absolute. Their corpses became propaganda, proof that treachery never paid, even though everyone knew it paid very well, right up until it didn't. This cycle of employment, betrayal, and execution turned assassins into shadows of shadows, men who were already dead long before their bodies fell. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. A medieval assassin's life ended not with a climax, but with an erasure, as if history itself wanted to blot out the existence of men who proved too clearly that power was maintained not by laws or prayers, but by blades wielded in silence and blood spilled without witness. Chapter 5. Daggers in the Court. Politics written in blood. If knights fought wars in sunlight, assassins fought them in shadows, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the politics of medieval courts, where every banquet goblet, every whispered letter, every shadow at a stairwell could mean death. To rule in the Middle Ages was not simply to survive armies, it was to survive proximity, because the deadliest blade was not wielded on the battlefield, but in the dining hall. Rulers across Europe lived in constant paranoia, because nobles and bishops, who smiled in daylight and kissed hands at Mass, often sent their messages not with ink, but with assassins. In the 12th century, Thomas Becket's bloody end at Canterbury Cathedral, though not technically the work of professional assassins, showed how political murder could sanctify itself as duty. A century later, in Italy's city-states, families like the Visconti, Medici, and Sforza turned assassination into a civic art. Florentine archives detail how special payments were dispersed after suspicious deaths of rivals, sometimes disguised as illness, sometimes blamed on street ruffians, but the careful timing, always before key elections or marriages, betrayed the truth. Assassins were the punctuation marks of politics, a dagger here, a vial of arsenic there, silencing opposition faster than speeches or sermons. And what makes this most disturbing is how normalized it became. Venice's notorious Council of Ten, established in the 14th century, openly employed special agents to eliminate enemies abroad. Official records show payments for daggers of silence and expenses for journeys not recorded, bureaucratic euphemisms hiding murder in the neat handwriting of state clerks. The church, too, was not immune. Popes and cardinals feuded with poison more often than pen, and papal kitchens became theaters of suspicion, where tasters died young. One Venetian chronicler described courtiers who refused to eat grapes or figs offered in season, knowing fruits could be soaked in poison. The assassin was not a rogue outsider. He was infrastructure, part of the machinery of power, as much a tool of governance as the tax collector or the bailiff. To study medieval politics without assassins is to miss its true grammar. The threat of murder shaped alliances, dictated treaties, and decided succession more often than battles. A prince who smiled at a banquet might die before dessert. A bishop's sermon could be cut short by a needle dipped in venom. And the assassins themselves were tools of propaganda. their bloody work whispered about by design, because terror spreads faster than ink. What unsettles us most today is not that assassins killed, but that their killings worked. Dynasties shifted, cities changed rulers, wars ended, not through the clashing of swords, but through a silent hand slipping poison into a chalice. Assassins didn't merely kill men, they edited history, and every dagger strike was a red stroke across the ledger of power, turning blood into policy and silence into governance. Chapter 6: The Phantom Legacy: How Assassins Haunted the Medieval World. When the assassin's dagger disappeared into flesh, it didn't end there. Their legacy bled outward, haunting Europe like a phantom that no church bell could exorcise. Rumor was their greatest weapon, and long after an actual killing, it was the fear of the assassin that controlled behavior. Chronicles from France and England describe nobles sleeping with torches, lit all night, guards doubling shifts, kings refusing to sit with their backs to doors. The word assassin itself became a spell, muttered in courts to justify suspicion, whispered in markets to explain sudden deaths, and invoked in chronicles to terrify readers. By the late Middle Ages, the Hashashin of the East were legendary across Europe, their exploits exaggerated by crusaders, who returned with tales of killers leaping from parapets, smiling as they plunged daggers into generals before being hacked apart. Whether true or not, these stories seeded a myth that assassins were more than men. They were shadows, demons, inevitabilities. And myths have teeth. Italian merchants wrote of rivals falling sick after feasts, their deaths blamed not on poor sanitation, but on the brotherhood of silence. In Germany, folk tales merged assassins with revenants, claiming killers rose from their graves to finish unfinished contracts. Even children were warned to behave, lest the assassin appear from darkness, a bogeyman more feared than the wolf. Politically, the legacy lingered in laws. By the 15th century, some states banned masks, cloaks, and even daggers in city centers, proof of how the assassin's craft had reshaped civic order. But repression couldn't erase the fear. Secret police systems in Venice and Florence owed much to assassin paranoia, while royal courts across Europe institutionalized food tasters and elaborate rituals of entry, precisely because the phantom of assassination hovered over every throne. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this legacy is how it blurred the boundary between reality and rumor. Many deaths recorded as plague or accident were whispered to be assassinations, and in a world where record-keeping was fragile, rumor often became history. Did a duke die of fever, or was it powder slipped in his broth? Did a bishop fall from a horse, or was the saddle cut? The uncertainty itself was power, because the mere possibility of assassination forced rulers into constant vigilance, reshaping their psyches into fortresses of fear. The assassin's legacy was not just the corpses they left behind, but the climate of dread that lingered for centuries. And in this climate, medieval society learned a chilling lesson, that true power doesn't always come from swords and sunlight, but from daggers in silence. Even now, when we use the word assassinate, we are not merely describing a murder, we are invoking a medieval specter, a ghost of politics sharpened on steel and dipped in poison, a ghost that still walks among us every time power is challenged, not with debate, but with death. Chapter 7: Outcasts in the Shadows. Feared, shunned, and condemned. To call a medieval assassin merely a killer for hire is to miss the more disturbing truth. They were walking paradoxes, indispensable to the powerful but untouchable to everyone else. In the cities of Italy, Germany, and France, assassins lived double lives, not only because disguise was their trade, but because society demanded their invisibility. Executioners were already despised outcasts, shunned because their hands handled death. Assassins bore an even darker stigma because, unlike the headsmen whose killings were public, their murders hid in shadows. They could never truly belong to a guild, a parish, or even a family for long. Chroniclers in Milan describe men who were whispered to be knives of the Visconti, never invited to feasts, barred from guild chapels, living on the margins like human tools, sheathed only until summoned. Imagine the daily isolation of such men, eating alone in tavern corners, their gold not enough to purchase companionship, their eyes scanning doorways as if expecting betrayal with every creak of the wood. Priests hesitated to absolve them, for though all sins could be confessed, few dared extend forgiveness to men who might kill again on command. Even prostitutes refused their coin in some towns, fearing that a night's intimacy might end with a throat cut to silence loose lips. And yet, despite this shunning, assassins were necessary. Their very ostracism made them useful, because being outside society made it easier to betray it. They were the expendables, the deniable instruments, the ones who could be erased without consequence. Nobles never dined with them, but they wrote their names in coded ledgers. Cities denounced them from pulpits, but their councils paid them in silence. This tension bred paranoia, even in the assassins themselves. Many cultivated reputations of supernatural power, claiming to commune with demons, to brew poisons from the breath of snakes, to summon invisibility through pagan charms, because fear was their only shield against betrayal. The disturbing irony is that even though they were despised, they often became legends precisely because of that fear. Folk tales turned them into more than men, phantoms, half-demons, cursed souls condemned to wander alleys until Judgment Day. And so the assassin lived like a ghost while alive, and even after death, his memory haunted the streets he once stalked. Children were warned not to wander at night, lest they meet the dagger man. Families disgraced by kin, who became assassins, sometimes erased their names from family records. In a world where salvation was communal, mass, feasts, processions, assassins were isolated even in their faith. They were not citizens. They were shadows licensed by the powerful, but condemned by the powerless. Their lives remind us that medieval society was not just divided by rich and poor, noble and peasant, but also by those who killed openly and those who killed silently, and the assassin belonged to no category except that of the perpetual outsider, feared by all, used by many, trusted by none. Chapter 8. Martyrs of Silence. When assassins became symbols. If the assassin's life was disturbing, their deaths were sometimes stranger still, because occasionally the very men shunned as monsters became martyrs, symbols twisted by rumor, religion, or rebellion. Consider the Hashashin of the Middle East. To their enemies, they were demons who stabbed generals in broad daylight. To their followers, they were warriors of faith, martyrs walking willingly into death. Chroniclers of the Crusades describe how assassins sometimes made no attempt to flee after a kill, as if the act itself was worth more than survival. They became spectacles of terror, daggers held high, blood on their hands, smiling as they were hacked apart by guards. The message was clear: we do not fear death, but you should fear us. That is martyrdom of a twisted kind. In Europe, the transformation was subtler, but no less eerie. Captured assassins occasionally confessed under torture that they had acted on orders of God or saints, recasting their bloody contracts as divine missions. Some heretical sects in Germany and Bohemia Even claimed assassins were chosen instruments of heavenly justice, punishing corrupt lords with knives where sermons had failed. Chroniclers scoff at this, but the mere survival of the claim shows how fluid medieval thought was, where one man's murderer could become another man's holy avenger. Even in Italy, assassins employed by Republican factions were sometimes posthumously praised as saviors of liberty, their daggers remembered not as tools of murder, but as weapons of freedom. This martyr-making was dangerous because it gave assassins a second life. Rumors magnified their exploits. Failures became legends. Deaths turned into stories of sacrifice. Imagine a peasant hearing in the tavern that a hated duke was slain by a lone killer who vanished into the night. It mattered little whether the assassin was caught or killed. What mattered was that the mighty had fallen to the humble hand of one man with a blade. That story inspired more fear in rulers than entire armies, because it proved power could be punctured by shadows. And so assassins, hated in life, sometimes became saints in death, not canonized by Rome, but canonized in whispers, songs, and secret admiration. The disturbing truth is that medieval society could not contain the assassin within a single narrative. They were monsters, yes, but also tools, warnings, symbols, and sometimes reluctant martyrs. Their lives were erased, but their deaths multiplied into meanings no lord could control. In that paradox lay their ultimate legacy. Men who lived as shadows, but died as echoes, haunting thrones, councils, and even the imagination of the common folk. And those echoes never truly faded. They simply shifted, becoming the myths that gave birth to spies, revolutionaries, and the entire shadow world of politics that thrives even now. Chapter 9. Eyes in the Dark, Assassins and the Birth of Espionage. By the late Middle Ages, the assassin's dagger was no longer just a weapon. It was the sharp tip of an emerging system we would recognize today as intelligence. While knights clashed in open battle and kings debated treaties in grand halls, assassins crept through shadows, gathering secrets with as much precision as they delivered death. In the Italian city-states Florence, Venice, Milan, the boundary between assassin and spy blurred until they were virtually indistinguishable. A man who could slip unnoticed into a lord's chamber to poison his cup could just as easily slip away with letters hidden in his sleeves. Rulers realized that information was as deadly as any blade, and so assassins became dual tools, killers when necessary, but more often silent observers embedded in courts, guilds, and merchant houses. Venetian archives from the 14th century reveal chilling accounts of special envoys dispatched not with letters of diplomacy, but with blank instructions, their tasks decided orally to avoid any paper trail. Payments were made in coin, yes, but also in promises of sanctuary, forged documents, and the kind of invisibility only bureaucracy could bestow. What makes this shift disturbing is how systematized it became. Assassins were no longer lone wolves. They were nodes in networks. Venice's Council of Ten, Florence's ruling Signoria, and the papal Curia all developed what could only be described as early secret services, employing killers and spies interchangeably. These men reported troop movements, overheard conspiracies, and when ordered, removed key obstacles with a dagger or a vial of poison. Chronicles describe assassins disguised as pilgrims, monks, even wandering minstrels, moving across borders with no suspicion. In fact, some blended their kills into ritual performances. A song delivered in a tavern could end with a lord keeling over, poisoned by the goblet handed to him mid-verse. The assassin's evolution into spy also reflected a grim practicality. Open murder was costly, creating martyrs and chaos. Espionage, by contrast, weakened enemies quietly. So assassins learned to write ciphers, to read seals, to forge signatures. They studied languages not to trade, but to infiltrate. Some even used prostitutes and servants as informants, weaving networks of gossip into strategies of power. The assassin became the hidden infrastructure of politics, no longer a mere tool of terror, but a collector of truths, and the truth in the medieval world was often more explosive than any blade. Yet this new role did not lessen the darkness of their existence. Instead, it expanded it. A spy could live years embedded in a foreign court, smiling daily at those he was tasked to betray. His mask was thicker, his paranoia greater, his silence heavier. Assassins in this period became living vaults of secrets, their tongues as dangerous as their knives. The disturbing consequence was that many never survived long after their missions. Rulers, terrified of leaks, often ordered the quiet disposal of their own assassins once their usefulness ended. In this sense, espionage was not liberation, it was a deeper prison. The assassin was not just an executioner, but also the executed, condemned to live in a cycle where every mission carried within it the seeds of their own erasure. And from this cycle, modern intelligence culture was born: secrecy, deniability, expendability. The assassin's shadow stretched forward into the age of states, bureaucracies, and empires, shaping how governments would forever after conduct their dearest work. Chapter 10: From Dagger to Mask, the Renaissance Reinvention of the Assassin. As Europe slid from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, the assassin did not vanish. He evolved, adopting the silk of diplomacy, the ink of bureaucracy, and the flourish of theater to cloak the same disturbing craft. Courts that once relied on blunt blades in dark alleys now demanded subtler methods: poisons distilled in alchemists' workshops, powders that imitated natural disease, and elaborate disguises that turned killers into courtiers, jesters, or even confessors. In Florence, the Medici learned this lesson well. Conspiracies like the Pazzi plot of 1478, where assassins struck inside a cathedral during High Mass, revealed how murder could no longer be hidden, but had to be staged as political theater. The Renaissance loved spectacle, and so did assassination. Killings were orchestrated for maximum drama, timed to sermons, feasts, or weddings, ensuring their message spread faster than rumor alone. What changed most was style. Renaissance assassins were less the ragged outcasts of the early Middle Ages and more polished instruments of statecraft. Some were educated, fluent in Latin, familiar with scripture, able to quote Virgil as they slipped poison into a chalice. Their tools became works of art: jeweled daggers designed to pass as noble ornaments, rings concealing poisoned needles, powders hidden in perfumed pouches. Italian artisans who crafted reliquaries for saints were sometimes the same who forged hollow rings for killers. Piety and murder born from the same forge. Chronicles from Rome and Naples describe courtesans trained as assassins, slipping poison in kisses or singing ballads that ended with death by dagger concealed in a lute's hollow body. But beneath the new elegance, the old terror remained. Assassins of the Renaissance were still disposable, still feared, still erased. The very sophistication of their craft only deepened their isolation. Unlike knights who basked in pageantry, assassins had to watch their legends slip away into rumor, their kills credited to illness or accident. And yet their invisibility was the very measure of their success. The disturbing paradox sharpened. The more perfect the assassin's work, the less he existed. Their reinvention also birthed something enduring, the concept of the assassin, not as thug, but as symbol. The Renaissance imagination, steeped in humanism and art, transformed killers into metaphors of fate, shadows in plays, whispers in poetry. Machiavelli himself, though rarely explicit, embedded the assassin's logic in the prince, that power must sometimes be maintained by discreet cruelty, by a single decisive strike. Literature and rumor gave assassins a strange immortality, even as their real lives remained short and brutal. By the 16th century, assassins had become both invisible men and larger-than-life myths. They haunted palaces and plays alike, shaping politics while shaping imagination. The disturbing life of a medieval assassin had not ended. It had only changed costume, trading chainmail for silks, alley daggers for jeweled rings, superstition for science. And in this transformation, they proved a truth as sharp as any blade. Murder, when dressed in elegance and reason, becomes not just tolerated, but admired. Chapter 11. Mercenaries of Silence. Assassins in the Age of Empires. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as Europe's feudal patchwork hardened into kingdoms and empires, assassins did not vanish. They adapted, grafting themselves onto the booming trade of mercenaries, who now fought wars for wages instead of loyalty. The condottieri of Italy were armies for hire, selling blood by the contract. But within their ranks thrived a more disturbing subset, men who specialized not in battles, but in removals. These killers were no longer the half-starved alley dwellers of earlier centuries, but professionals who moved from warband to warband, their services whispered about in campfires, their reputations traveling faster than their feet. Chroniclers describe commanders hiring daggermen to slip into enemy tents at night, or to bribe cooks into serving poisoned stews. Wars that appeared won by cavalry charges often hinged on a single corpse, an enemy captain silenced before dawn, a noble heir struck down in his sleep. The assassin became part of the logistics of war, no different than paying for fodder or cannons. The disturbing part was how casual it became. Venetian and Spanish records list expenditures for special operations, alongside grain shipments and salaries for arquebusiers. Empires, increasingly bureaucratic, learned to budget for assassination as if it were just another department of war. Even monarchs who publicly condemned such practices in sermons or letters engaged in them behind closed doors. The Habsburgs, the Valois, the Tudors, all relied on shadows. Catherine de' Medici's France dripped with rumors of daggers and vials hidden in embroidery cases, and her enemies nicknamed her the Black Queen for her alleged use of poisoners and killers disguised as servants. What made assassins in this period especially frightening was their mobility. The medieval assassin had often been trapped in local politics, bound to a single lord or city, but with the rise of empires, killers could now move across continents, and a man who slit throats in Florence might be hired by Spanish nobles in Naples, then travel north to Antwerp under another name. Borders meant little. They were cosmopolitan shadows, as comfortable in Moorish markets as in German taverns, their disguises shifting with the languages they picked up. And their patrons valued this. Assassins became instruments of empire, softening resistance before invasions, silencing dissent in colonies, ensuring rulers died before rebellions could harden into wars. The more sophisticated empires became, the more their assassins blurred into early intelligence services. The English crown in the reign of Elizabeth I relied on spy masters like Francis Walsingham, whose agents combined surveillance, interception of letters, and assassination when necessary. The very vocabulary of modern espionage, agents, cells, coded ciphers, emerged from the hybrid life of assassins turned spies. But even as their work professionalized, their lives remained as fragile as ever. Monarchs could not publicly condone assassination, so assassins were burned, hanged, or disavowed when exposed. They were both celebrated in whispers and erased in daylight. The ledger of empire was written in two inks, black for treaties, red for bodies cut down in silence. And through it all, the assassin remained what he had always been, an expendable mercenary of silence, purchased not for glory, not for loyalty, but for his willingness to make death look like fate. Their disturbing persistence reminds us that empires were not just built on ships and muskets, but on daggers that slipped unnoticed through curtains, reshaping the world one corpse at a time. Chapter 12: Shadows and Memory, the Psychological Legacy of Assassins. The assassin's knife did not only cut flesh, it carved scars into Europe's collective mind, scars that outlasted the Middle Ages and Renaissance, lingering as superstitions, fears, and even cultural archetypes. To understand this legacy, you must imagine the climate of paranoia their existence created. Rulers dined with tasters, not merely out of prudence, but because everyone believed assassins were everywhere. The very air of politics became charged with suspicion, and this suspicion became tradition. Even when rulers were not killed by assassins, they governed as if they might be. This constant vigilance warped monarchies and parliaments alike, institutionalizing mistrust. The assassin had colonized their psychology. For ordinary people, assassins became folklore. In taverns and marketplaces, stories exaggerated their power until they became almost supernatural. Men who could vanish through walls, women who killed with a kiss, killers who summoned death by whispering a victim's name under the new moon. Parents warned children not to wander at night, lest the assassin find them. Songs mocked rulers by implying they lived in fear of the dagger. In some places, assassins became ghostly figures, spirits who haunted crossroads, faceless men lurking in corners of memory. Even as literacy spread, the assassin remained more rumor than record, an archetype embedded in imagination. The psychological effect reached further. Because assassins struck from shadows, they bred a cultural obsession with visibility, ceremony, and ritual. Monarchs paraded themselves in heavily guarded processions, their bodies surrounded by walls of protocol. Palaces became fortresses of etiquette designed to filter out potential killers. Every bow, every kiss of the hand, every removed hat was not just custom, but security theater. The very architecture of Europe, walls, gates, guarded chambers, was shaped by fear of shadows. Even art absorbed this paranoia. Paintings of tyrannicide celebrated liberty, but also reminded viewers that rulers fell to knives, not just armies. But perhaps the deepest legacy was moral confusion. The assassin was both despised and admired, cursed as a demon, yet secretly praised as the hand of justice. When hated tyrants fell, people whispered thanks not to armies, but to unknown men with daggers. This duality created a psychological dissonance. Assassination was condemned in law and faith, yet desired in fantasy and gossip. That contradiction still echoes today whenever the death of a powerful figure prompts both mourning and whispers of relief. The disturbing truth is that assassins reshaped not only politics, but consciousness. They taught Europe that power was fragile, that authority was mortal, that even kings were vulnerable to a single hand in the dark. and once that lesson was learned, it could never be unlearned. The assassin became more than a profession. He became an archetype, a specter forever haunting the corridors of memory. Even now, centuries later, we live in a world built on their shadow, a world where leaders travel in armored cars, where rumors of plots never die, where fear of the silent killer still shapes policy, architecture, and imagination. The assassin may have died as a man, but he endures as a ghost, an eternal reminder that the blade in the dark is the oldest language of power. Chapter 13, From Dagger to Pistol, Assassins in the Age of Revolutions. As Europe lurched into the early modern age, gunpowder roaring across battlefields, printing presses spreading ideas like wildfire, the assassin's dagger did not retire. It simply changed shape. The pistol, the musket, and the bomb became the new tools of silence, but the logic remained medieval. Strike at the head, and the body of the state collapses. The late Renaissance and early Enlightenment gave birth to waves of revolutions, conspiracies, and religious wars, and assassins walked at the heart of them all. Kings, popes, and tsars, who had once feared daggers, now feared bullets, fired at close range, or bombs smuggled under cloaks. The very technology that promised progress only made assassination easier, faster, and louder. Consider the 1584 murder of William the Silent, leader of the Dutch Revolt, shot point blank by Balthasar Gerard, a man who considered himself both assassin and martyr. The echoes were medieval. The killer saw himself not as a criminal, but as God's executioner. Across Europe, rulers built networks of secret police to root out plots, but the assassin always found cracks. By the 17th century, attempts on monarchs became almost seasonal. Kings of France alone suffered multiple stabbings and shootings in their palaces, proving that architecture and protocol could never fully cage the phantom of the assassin. In England, the gunpowder plot of 1605, though foiled, shows how the medieval appetite for spectacular death mutated into something industrial. No dagger this time, but barrels of gunpowder meant to erase Parliament in one fiery instant. That was assassination scaled up, medieval shadows reborn as modern terror. What's disturbing is how the assassin began to merge with the revolutionary. In the medieval world, he had been a tool of nobles, popes, and merchants. But in the age of revolutions, assassins increasingly claimed to speak for the people. The French Revolution turned regicide into public duty, transforming the executioner's scaffold into an assassin's theater scaled up for the masses. Political radicals across Europe looked back not at knights or kings for inspiration, but at assassins, those nameless men who had proved that one strike could change dynasties. Italian nationalists, Russian nihilists, and anarchists in Paris and London all wrapped themselves in the assassin's mantle, wielding knives, bombs, and pistols as symbols of justice against tyrants. The old medieval paradox, killer or martyr, criminal or savior, was reborn in the modern age with even sharper edges. Yet the assassin remained disposable. For every revolutionary, celebrated in song, a dozen others rotted in dungeons, executed and forgotten, their names scrubbed from history. But their myth grew. Each bullet, each blade, each bomb carried not just the weight of death, but the whisper of possibility, that rulers were mortal, that states could be unmade, that shadows could overturn empires. The assassin's disturbing medieval life had survived the march of centuries, dressed now in gunpowder smoke instead of chainmail shadows. The weapon had changed, but the psychology was eternal. Chapter 14, The Eternal Shadow. Assassins in Modern Memory and Culture. By the time Europe entered the 19th and 20th centuries, the assassin was no longer just a profession or even a revolutionary archetype. He was a cultural obsession. Novels, plays, and newspapers turned every attempted assassination into spectacle. Just as medieval towns had gathered to jeer at the pillory, modern crowds devoured illustrated pamphlets and penny dreadfuls, describing in lurid detail how a king was shot, how a minister fell, how a bomb exploded in a crowded square. The assassin became a celebrity of infamy, his disturbing life retold in art as both cautionary tale and thrilling drama. Dostoevsky wrote of Russian radicals who treated assassination like sacrament. French feuilleton portrayed daggermen as tragic heroes. Italian operas turned poisoners into divas. What had once been whispered in markets now filled theaters and newsstands. The myth even leapt continents. In the Ottoman Empire, in India, in Japan, secret societies adopted the logic of the medieval assassin. Sacrifice yourself to strike at power, become both weapon and message. Japanese ninjas, already legendary, were reinterpreted by Western writers through the same lens as the Hashashin, shadowy killers, masters of disguise, creatures of terror and fascination. Assassination became globalization's dark passenger, a language understood from Moscow to Istanbul to Washington. And in each retelling, the medieval roots showed silence, secrecy, inevitability. But perhaps the most disturbing part is how we still live with the assassin's ghost. Every time a president, prime minister, or monarch is killed or threatened, the news coverage echoes medieval chronicles, obsessed with the killer's motives, the details of their disguise, the weapon used. Even our entertainment resurrects them. Novels, films, and video games cast assassins as protagonists, draping their disturbing isolation in glamour, selling their centuries of paranoia as adventure. The very word assassin has shifted from curse to brand, proof that the archetype has sunk so deep into our collective psyche that we consume it willingly, even joyfully. Yet peel back the romance, and the reality is the same as it was in the Middle Ages. The assassin's life is not freedom, but prison. Endless masks, endless suspicion, endless disposability. They are used, discarded, remembered only when convenient, their humanity stripped away to become message, symbol, spectacle. That is the true horror, not the kills, but the emptiness of the killer's existence. The assassin, medieval or modern, is always a shadow, never fully seen, never fully human, forever haunting the edges of history. And so the disturbing life of the medieval assassin has never truly ended. It has only evolved, wearing new clothes, holding new weapons, but carrying the same burden, to be the hand that strikes, the ghost that vanishes, the whisper that endures. In the silence between heartbeat and dagger thrust, between gunshot and echo, lies a truth older than kingdoms. Power is fragile, authority is mortal, and somewhere in the shadows there is always a man willing to prove it. Chapter 15. The Final Silence. Why the Assassin's Shadow Still Haunts Us. To speak of the assassin as if he belonged only to the Middle Ages is a comfortable lie, one that allows us to trap his disturbing life behind museum glass alongside racks and gallows. But the truth is more unsettling. The assassin never belonged to one century. He was born of hunger and hierarchy, thrived on politics and paranoia, and persists in every whisper we still tell about power and its fragility. His shadow stretches from the crumbling walls of medieval castles to the mirrored corridors of modern parliaments, unchanged in essence, though disguised in costume. The assassin's trade has always been the same: to turn one body into a message, one death into a monument, one silence into a roar that echoes louder than armies. The disturbing life of a medieval assassin endures not because of their numbers, they were few compared to soldiers or thieves, but because of their symbolism. Each killer in the shadows proved what no king, bishop, or emperor wanted admitted, that the mightiest could be undone by the weakest, that power was not absolute, but pierced by a single blade, a pinch of poison, or a bullet whispered from the dark. That truth terrified rulers and enthralled the ruled. It explains why assassins were shunned yet used, erased yet remembered, despised yet mythologized. They represented both the deepest fear of authority and the secret hope of those crushed beneath it, that power could bleed, that thrones could topple, that history could hinge on a solitary hand in the night. Their legacy is carved not only in chronicles, but in the very architecture of our world. Medieval rulers built gates, moats, and guards against them. Modern states build intelligence agencies, bodyguards, armored convoys. The assassin's presence lingers in every protocol of security, in every sealed motorcade, in every scan of a guest at a banquet. It is the medieval lesson institutionalized. Fear the unseen, fear the silent, fear the man who may already be standing beside you with a smile on his lips and a dagger beneath his cloak. And yet what makes their story truly terrifying is not the death they dealt, but the life they lived. The assassin was never free. He was trapped in an endless masquerade, mistrusted by allies, hunted by enemies, discarded by employers. His existence was a wound disguised as a profession, a life without family, without faith, without permanence. He was not a man of honor like the knight, nor a man of faith like the monk, nor even a man of trade like the merchant. He was a cipher, a ghost, defined only by the emptiness he created in others. That is why his life was disturbing. It was not just violent, it was hollow, a human reduced to tool, stripped of identity until he vanished even from his own reflection. And still we are fascinated. We dress assassins in the glamour of video games, novels, and films. We imagine them as noble rebels, tragic heroes, or sleek anti-heroes. We strip away the filth, the paranoia, the isolation, and keep only the sharp edge of their skill. But in doing so, we repeat the very cycle that created them, denying their humanity, turning them once more into symbols rather than people. In truth, the assassin's story is not romantic, but cautionary. It warns us of what happens when societies normalize killing as policy, when power relies not on trust or justice, but on fear and erasure. So tonight, when we close this history of shadows, let us remember not just the daggers, the poisons, and the disguises, but the silence that followed them. The silence of rulers suddenly gone, the silence of crowds stunned into obedience, the silence of the assassin himself, erased, forgotten, buried without name. That silence is the assassin's true legacy, a reminder that authority is fragile, justice is manipulable, and humanity can be hollowed out until all that remains is a shadow moving through history with a blade. The disturbing life of the medieval assassin is not really medieval, it is eternal. It lingers in every rumor of conspiracy, every whisper of a plot, every fascination we still have with killers who live in darkness. And until we confront why we both fear and admire them, their shadow will remain, waiting at the edge of every throne, every pulpit, every parliament, proving with each century that silence can be louder than speech, and that death, when delivered from the shadows, never really dies. And so the trail ends, not with a sword clash or a grand revelation, but with something quieter, the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the night. The disturbing life of the medieval assassin was never about glory. It was about shadows, about how fear could be bought, how silence could be sharpened, and how a single hand could rewrite the fate of kings. Their world has long crumbled, their fortresses eroded into ruins, their names scattered like dust in forgotten ledgers. Yet the lesson remains. Power, whether robed in crowns or carried in briefcases, is never invulnerable. It is always waiting for its shadow. If the assassin still lingers in our imagination, it is not because we crave their cruelty, but because we recognize their truth. Behind every throne, behind every sermon, behind every empire, there is always the possibility of the blade unseen, the whisper unheard, the silence unbroken. That possibility humbles rulers, frightens societies, and fascinates us still. So we leave them here, these men of the dagger and the poison vial, not heroes, not villains, but warnings. Their lives disturb us because they remind us how thin the line is between order and chaos, trust and betrayal, power and ruin, and while their footsteps fade into the past, their shadow remains, stretching long across history, reminding us that in every age, someone, somewhere, will always be watching from the dark.